Nostalgia is basically the whole name of the game in British politics, you know. It's sort of, there's tinges of it.
What pushed England to expand globally?
But all the time that they were developing this transatlantic trade, they were actually developing something that was unprecedented in human history.
Called racial terror, because you are stripping somebody of their identity.
He not only altered the essence of the Acropolis, but he did quite a lot of damage in the sculptures themselves.
Having the originals connected wherever they exist.
This is also a purely imperialistic story.
So that is where I was coming. You take over the charge when it was 34%. After 150 years, you leave it at 1.8%.
How did they evolve from being traders to becoming rulers?
I mean, given the fact that we talk in English, so I mean, this is one of the parts of the British heritage.
You name me that wasn't cruel sometimes toward its subjects. You need to remember the British Empire lasted 400 years.
If you look at countries in the world which are most nostalgic about their empires, you'd have to put Russia at the top.
I would say the British have quite a complex relationship with their imperial past. It's very different to, say, German attitudes to the Nazi period. I mean,
does Britain still imagine itself as an empire? Hello, friends. You might have heard the joke, why are the pyramids in Egypt? Because they were too heavy to steal and put in the British Museum. In part, the joke is about the museum itself. We are going to talk about it and about the items the British did bring here from their colonies too. But the joke is mostly about the British Empire too. At the peak of its power at the beginning of the 20th century, it occupied 1/4 of the planet's landmass, possessed territories on all 7 continents, and governed 450 million people, about 1/4 of the total population at the time. And its slogan was, "The sun never sets on the British Empire," because Britain's imperial possessions spanned all time zones. And the British pound was the world's main currency. Even though that's all in the past, the empire collapsed in the mid-20th century, many people remain convinced that British imperialism is still alive. About 15 countries, including Canada and Australia, which are quite big, de jure, treat the King-Queen of the UK as their monarch. Most of the former colonies are still unified in the Commonwealth of Nations. It consists of 56 countries. By the way, not everything is going smoothly within the Commonwealth. There are talks about reparations the UK owes its former colonies. They are talking fantastic sums like 18 trillion pounds or 24 trillion US dollars or 8 times the UK's yearly GDP. They are demanding compensation for 200 years of colonialism and the slave trade. Besides, recently, when relations between the West and Russia are as cold as ever, we see and hear yet again that the UK, not the US, is Russia's arch nemesis or proto-enemy. They openly say that the reason is imperialism, the imperialistic way of thinking that makes them see Russia as a rival. Anyway, we thought now would be a good time to talk about the British Empire's history and find out if the empire still lives. That's why not only did we come here, to the heart of the empire, but we also visited the countries that used to be the colonies, the countries from which treasures were stolen and put here, in the British Museum. And we tried to find out how the relationships within the empire were back then, what they are like now, within the former empire, and if an imperialistic way of thinking is still in their heads.
Yeah, I think you need amnesia to be nostalgic, because if you properly knew what the empire involved, you know, the slavery, the environmental destruction, the famine, the exploitation, you wouldn't be so nostalgic about it. But because we don't think about it properly, it just comes out in weird ways sometimes. I think one of the ways it came out was with Brexit. I think Britain always struggled to be a member of the European Union because they'd ruled a quarter of the world. After that, joining a membership organisation felt like a demotion. So for lots of British people, it never felt right that we were like taking instructions from France or Spain or having to compromise, given we basically dictated how the world ran for a large part of history.
Speaking of nostalgia, imperial nostalgia, what specifically would British people be nostalgic of?
Gosh, so many things. I mean, if you look at the films that we make about the British Empire, they tend to be very rose-tinted views of India. If you look at the documentaries that even now we see on BBC Two, I think it comes out in the way our politicians talk about Britain. They were often talking about Britain as being world leaders. And I think a lot of that goes back to the fact that we ran this huge empire and we still feel nostalgic about it in all sorts of ways.
Imperial nostalgia is basically the whole name of the game in British politics. You know, it's sort of there's tinges of it, little moments, spatterings of it, ranging from full on manage the whole foreign policy thing. You know, or well, not just all policies to some extent directed in this way of sort of like mobilizing a certain kind of imperial nostalgia, a longing for like when Britain was great, when Britannia ruled the waves. And of course, a lot of that is complicated because a lot of it's wrapped up in the fact that the 1950s and 60s, when Britain still just about had an empire, at that time, it was the post-war boom and the post-war consensus. So the British economy was doing pretty well, and working class people had a much better standard of living. So people being nostalgic for that time makes a lot of sense. You know, I would be if I lived then.
Fundamental shift in historical consciousness across Europe in relation to the enduring legacies of colonialism. And people are seeing these histories, understanding these histories. The big Queen Victoria-sized black hole that we have had in this country in terms of historical consciousness, where if you have a conversation about empire, enslavement has been reduced to a sort of celebratory story that the British ended it with abolition and then emancipation, and then that brings us up into the 1830s, and then you get Queen Victoria, and then suddenly there's a gap until we get the First World War. There's a long history there in which what's happened with the major compensation payments that were made to those people not who suffered from enslavement, but who were the supposed owners of those people, the £20 million that was only repaid by taxpayers in this country as recently as 2015. That's a very good metaphor in some ways for the ways in which we're still dealing with the debts and obligations of the past. So many have argued that seeing as the compensation was paid to the slave owners, what about the descendants of enslaved people? Is there a debt there? And certainly the case has been made very forcefully. So there's this big spectrum that runs from objects through ancestral remains, into other forms of debt.
In 1753, in London, scientist and Dr. Hans Sloane died. He left behind an unusual will to sell the government his collection of natural rarities and art he'd been collecting his whole life for £20,000. Now it would be $5 million US. Parliament agreed and passed an act establishing the British Museum. 3 collections were joined together, that of Sloane, 2 libraries that belonged to Robert Harley, the first Earl of Oxford, and Robert Cotton's collection. Besides, the royal family donated a part of their literary collection. On 15th January 1759, the British Museum first opened its doors for visitors. For storing this collection, they provided Montague House, a mansion in the Bloomsbury district of London. Entrance was free, but you could visit the exposition only if you had a special permit. In fact, it meant that the museum was only open to wealthy citizens, to whom trustees and curators would give personal guided tours. It didn't stop the museum from expanding rapidly. In the 19th century, it was popular among the British elite to donate rarities and pieces of art they'd brought from the colonies. Soon, the small Montague House wasn't enough. First, they built some extensions, but in 1823, they constructed a new, larger neoclassical building. Here it is. It houses the British Museum to this day. Nowadays, it has about 8 million exhibits. Interestingly, most of them are stored in conservation facilities, and only 1% of the collection is put out on display at a time. This is one of the arguments used by people who want the treasures returned to their countries of origin. They ask, what's the point of keeping them in London if they are hidden here anyway?
So when we ask how many objects are in the British Museum now, we're told 8 million or maybe 9 million. That's a lot. That's a major margin of error when we're talking about an institution that over the years, over the past 30 years or so, has made the case that it is an institution that is able to safeguard world culture in a way that other museums around the world, other cultures would not be able to. I mean, we found out when it was discovered in 2023 that the British Museum impossibly appeared to have been stealing from itself. The reason that such events and alleged incidents were possible was that there isn't a comprehensive, accurate public archive of the objects in the British Museum, even now.
This is a true detective story. It was first shared by the Danish art dealer Yttergradel. According to him, about 10 years ago, he found a Brit on eBay with the username Sultan1966, who put a 19th century Medusa cameo up for sale. He charged only £15. The Dane bought and resold it for several thousand. He realized the cameo wasn't the only thing Sultan 1966 was offering. He continued putting up rings and other small jewelry on eBay. As the Danish art dealer said later, he thought the seller was an amateur who had no idea about his item's value and deliberately started offering him more money because he felt bad. The owner of the collection confirmed that he had no idea how these things worked. He just took the items from his late grandfather's collection, who owned a thrift store in York in the early 1950s. It went on until several years after these deals started. Gradel saw photos of some of the cameos that Sultan put up for sale in the catalog of the British Museum. Then he realized that it all stank and started his investigation. It turned out that the PayPal account this Sultan was using belonged to someone with the same name as one of the British Museum's curators, Peter Higgs. Sultan's email address had the word Bodrum in it. Higgs was in charge of the Department of Greece and Rome and even wrote a book about Greek sculptures from Bodrum. And the icing on the cake, Higgs' Twitter handle was @Sultan1966. He wasn't really trying to hide. It turned out the artifacts were stolen by Peter Higgs. An enormous scandal broke out. He was fired and tried. Soon after, the British Museum director resigned. Although officially his resignation didn't have to do with this story, everyone understood that it did. Why did everyone start talking about getting exhibits from the British Museum?
They felt it was the right moment because the head of the Commonwealth had changed. The monarch had changed. So there was an opportunity to raise this issue again. Besides, the general political situation in the world caused these topics to be brought up again. All this anti-colonialist rhetoric, the review of the former hegemon's influence, the monarchy, and so on. This all contributed to these talks and these debates.
Why are we holding on to Priam's treasure in the Pushkin Museum? It wasn't even us who excavated it.
That's right. We took it as a trophy during the Great Patriotic War.
Yes, as a trophy, but for a long time, the Soviet Union never acknowledged that they had it.
It was hidden, right?
It was exhibited only in the post-Soviet period.
The post-Soviet period.
So it's also pretty illustrative. It is a trophy, all right.
But we'll hide it.
Yes, until better days. The British don't hide them. Of course, the creation of this collection had to do with pillaging and exotic goods. It was all based on the belief that the locals wouldn't value them. They wouldn't realize what treasures they possess, their antiquity, their beauty and significance. Only we can evaluate it.
So in reality, the British Museum as we see it now is really a 19th century institution. That is when anthropology, world culture collections are coming in, it's when antiquities are coming in larger numbers. The arrival of the Parthenon marbles in the early years of the 19th century. So you're quite right, the Parthenon marbles are another one of those really iconic instances where the demand for returns of items that were taken, obviously under circumstances where there is no clear evidence that there was consent, that these things were taken legally.
In the early 19th century, Greece, we're in Athens now, was a part of the Ottoman Empire. The ambassador of Britain in Constantinople was Thomas Bruce, the 7th Earl of Elgin. He was Scottish. He traveled around the empire a lot and was obviously on good terms with the authorities. At some point, he got permission from them to transport the ruins of old buildings and temples. The main one was here in the Acropolis in Athens. Here it is, the Parthenon, the great work of the sculptor Phidias from the 5th century BC, one of the principal temples in world history.
When it is the most famous building in Greece, it is a perfect specimen of the classical past, of the classical period, that is 5th and 4th centuries before Christ, which is considered the peak of Greek civilization. In that time, it was one of the most spectacular buildings. And as such, it has acquired quite an important position in modern Greek identity as well.
Why was it constructed in the first place?
So this has to do with the position of Athens in the Greek world at the time. So the construction began in 447 BC, that is the middle of the 5th century, at which point Athens controlled the entire Aegean coast through her empire. She had an empire of islands and cities, and she ruled with an iron fist. And they wanted to celebrate their empire and their culture. So for all these reasons, they decided to go ahead and produce one of the most spectacular building programs of the ancient world that included, of course, the Acropolis, that's the temple, but also all the other buildings on the Acropolis itself. The Propylaea, that is a monumental entrance, of course, other temples and so on. And we see them now as white, but of course, in the ancient period, they were colored.
So in what state Lord Elgin found this structure at the beginning of the 19th century?
So this was a very well-known building because, of course, it stood for millennia. It was constructed, as I said, the 5th century BC, and it stood all this time. It had multiple uses over the years. The Ottomans made a mosque out of this. The Venetians built other buildings on top. So it was reused and reused throughout the millennia. So when Lord Elgin came in around 1800s, he saw the Parthenon with the fantastic statues of Phidias and a fantastic frieze that was in pretty good condition, and started taking it out to take it back home.
Why did the Ottomans give the Earl of Elgin permission so easily? He was obviously a British ambassador, an important person. There might have been other reasons, but in general, in the early 19th century, the idea of preserving cultural and architectural heritage wasn't rooted in society, at least not in the Ottoman Empire. In Europe and Britain itself, that idea was already planted in people's minds. However, there was still nothing like that here, and pieces of this ancient temple were just strewn around on this hill. That's how they ended up on the ground. When the Turks occupied Athens, munitions were stored here for a long time. In 1687, when the Ottoman Empire was waging one of its numerous wars, that time with the Venetians, during the shelling, a Venetian cannonball struck the Parthenon where the munitions were kept. They detonated a huge explosion. Ever since, the remnants of this majestic temple were scattered around here, which the Earl of Elgin took advantage of. In 1802, the Earl of Elgin loaded his collection into crates, several hundreds of them in total, and sent that all to London. Half of the original Parthenon statues, 15 metopes, plates with relievos, and 75 meters of the original frieze that decorated the exterior of this marvelous temple left their homeland.
So they're fighting, the Greeks fighting barbarians, the Greeks fighting monsters, the Greeks fighting women. So all of those celebrated essentially were the mythical parallel to the Persian Wars, where the Athenians defeated the Persians. So are different ways of celebrating the sense of Greekness and Athenian pride.
What we have heard, says Harrison, and these are in the letters of Lord Elgin, is that very soon the Greeks may provoke a revolution and be freed. And then you won't have a chance to remove any antiquities from there.
Oh, so he understood quite well what was going on.
Yes, of course. But Elgin had no idea of what the Parthenon was or the other monuments. This is what he decided to do when he heard that there is this possibility of perhaps gaining entrance to the Acropolis and mostly getting the paintings and maybe removing some antiquities. He never thought from the monument.
So his primary goal was enrichment and building his own house, not enlightening the British public.
But in his letters, for example, to encourage his own team, he was saying, we will do this to better the taste of the English. Or if someone would find out, he would say, I am working here so that I will show you what exists in these lands. But that didn't mean removing.
Do you think he was an imperialist or he was just a man interested in an enrichment?
He was a person very keen on elevating himself. He was very good at seizing the proper occasion, mules, paintings, various things that he could trade. And he was very good at that.
Is there in any way a kind of fairness? Is that when Athens were empire, they looted wealth from other nations which they conquered, and then when the Britain became an empire, and they actually did the same?
I wouldn't call it fair because I think imperialism is inherently unfair. There are different issues here. Yes, Athens was able to build that because it acquired wealth from its empire. But at the point this was built, it became an artistic whole. It became a piece of art. One of the issues with Elgin is that he took sculptures that were part of an artistic whole, and by ripping them out, he not only altered the essence of the Acropolis, but he did quite a lot of damage in the sculptures themselves. A lot of them broke.
In 1807, the Earl of Elgin put the first shipment of marbles on display in London. His exhibition amazed the audience back then. It was widely noted that the original sculptures from Greece outperformed the Roman replicas that were already well known in Britain. So it has stayed that way in the British Museum ever since. Here, I'll show you something fun and symbolic. Please take another look at this majestic facade. Does that ring any bells? Right, the facade of the British Museum. You can see the same number of columns even. 8 columns here and 8 columns there. The only difference is that here they are Doric instead of Ionic ones, but Never mind. So now we see what inspired architect Smirke to design his building. Although the museum was built decades after the Earl of Elgin procured those marbles, this design is such a clear reference to the museum's greatest treasure, holding such an ironic and, in a way, sarcastic message to be passed on up to this day. Since then, the Parthenon marbles have been housed in the British Museum. Now, a separate large room has been dedicated for them. One of the masterpieces is this frieze depicting a procession. Interestingly, this frieze was fixed to the outside of the Parthenon and was facing out as well. But as you can see here, that's what many experts ironically point out, it's the other way around, facing the inside of the building, which largely ruins the sculptor's original idea.
And that's a very good metaphor, I think, for the way in which the culture of some of our museums has developed in the 19th and 20th century, this inward-looking sense that the museum is a one-way street. It's where objects go to die. It's a carceral space. You know, these objects are locked up in the prison.
This room is called the Parthenon Sculptures. Previously, it was named the Elgin Room, after the lord who actually imported these sculptures.
When he actually moved them to Britain, so for some time it was not deemed as very important.
Yeah, because it has to do with what the contemporary British society considered as important. And at that point, Hellenistic art, which is much more expressive, much more Baroque, and it was only through bringing the sculptures back to the museum and people seeing the classical ideal by Phidias that suddenly the classical past, that is the product of the classical period, became far more appreciated in British society.
So even in those days, Lord Elgin's actions raised a lot of questions. Say Lord Byron, who visited Athens shortly after Elgin, wrote his poem Childe Harold's Pilgrimage and wrote the following phrase in Latin: "What the Goths did not do, the Scots did," since Elgin was Scottish. Wordplay, you see. By the way, Joseph Brodsky would later use it in his 20 sonnets to Mary Stuart. Here's a literal translation of the first line: "Mary, these Scots are cattle after all." However, the most precise wordplay here is possible only in Russian. Byron also wrote that Elgin was the vilest thief ever to be born on the land of Britain. He said it even back then.
Well, first of all, Byron was a liberal. He was quite different than the other aristocrats of his time. He even came to Greece and gave his life. This great passion that Byron had for freeing Greece. In 1811, he traveled on one of the boats that Lord Elgin had, the Hydra, which was taking away marbles from Athens. And Byron was leaving Athens from one of his visits, and he was there with a young Greek man named Nicolas Giraud, and they were sitting on these cases with marbles. And this is when he couldn't risk not feeling such, let's say, disgrace, because he too was from Scotland, and he felt that Elgin was disgracing English people, the Scottish people, by doing something totally, let's say, not barbarous, not disastrous, but totally unacceptable.
In 1816, here in London, parliamentary special proceedings were held to investigate how ethical and legal it was to procure these marbles. I mean, they were concerned more about the legal issue rather than the ethical one. But Elgin proved his actions were legal because the Turkish authorities gave him a firman. In other words, a paper authorizing Elgin to remove the marbles. Of course, he never presented this firman. To be more precise, what he did present only let him make life sketches of the majestic ruins and shift the stones of the Acropolis. One must agree that shifting stones is not the same as taking them, loading them into crates, and sending them across the sea to Great Britain. There's a weird history with these firmans. Two of these documents are in Britain. One is in Italian with no signatures at all, while the second is a translation into English signed by the then Ottoman government head. But we don't see the Sultan's signature, who was the only person entitled to give such approval.
But for me, it's of lesser importance. It's more important to discuss who has the right to own the classical past. And this is at the heart of modern British identity and modern Greek identity. Even if Elgin had all the legal documents of the world, because of the importance of the Parthenon for modern Greek identity, and of now the criticism of what British imperialism has done, and also the criticism of what museums stand for, I think the debate of who should house the Parthenon marbles would open again. So the legal position for me is not that important.
Greece gained independence from the Ottoman Empire back in 1830, and since then, for 200 years already, has been demanding the return of everything Elgin took from here. The official standpoint of the Greek authorities has always been the same, describing his actions as looting. The current Greek Prime Minister, Kyriakos Mitsotakis, has also demanded the Parthenon marbles be returned, as they are one of the most crucial areas of his foreign cultural policy, and he isn't even shying away from saying so.
If I told you that you would cut the Mona Lisa in half, and you would have half of it at the Louvre and half of it at the British Museum.
So here is perhaps a very interesting case where you have goddess Athena. Now, this is her head, this is her arm, and this is part of the drapery of her garment, and that shows because Zeus gave her a goat skin. And here you can see this specific garment that she was wearing. And these little pieces, as you see, are in Athens. Yes. But the bust is in London. So everyone would think that we want to see Athena as complete as she can be. So the story needs to be told properly by having the originals connected wherever they exist.
A while ago, we witnessed quite a funny scene when Mitsotakis paid a visit to London and former British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak declined a meeting with him at the very last minute, as if he was hiding from his Greek counterpart who had already arrived. It became known that Mitsotakis intended to raise the Parthenon issue in the upcoming talks. It would have been such an elephant in the room, especially with the ongoing political agenda, that Sunak couldn't come up with anything better than to simply cancel the meeting. In order to put an end to the argument that the Parthenon marbles are better preserved in the British Museum, this new building was even opened here. This is the new Acropolis Museum, where rooms have been dedicated to store those masterpieces currently displayed in the British Museum. The thing is, it was opened back in 2009, so it's been 16 years already. It's not that the British Museum says, in no way we would return them to you. Instead, there have been many talks and roundtables, but still, despite 65% of the British public favoring finally returning the Parthenon marbles to Greece, they never left the British Museum.
I think that's a fairly clear-cut case where they should go back to. There are various reasons, rationales trotted out for the British Museum to keep them. My personal opinion is that none of those justifications carry any real weight. To me, it seems to make sense to put them in context, along with the other marbles, in a museum at the site from which they were taken.
Over the decades, London rigidly responded that it's a point of no return and referred to a list of laws that forbid returning anything from the British Museum. As of now, however, from what I've found out after talking to curators and researchers here, this viewpoint has shifted quite dramatically. Just this decade, a major change in how to approach this issue has begun, and many anticipate the Parthenon marbles to be returned to Athens by late 2020s. The reason is, it's such a clear case of the marbles being illegally and unfairly taken away. In fact, the world knows two such cases, the Parthenon marbles and the Benin bronzes, which are also expected to make a comeback in the present decade. In the late 19th century, part of what we know today as Nigeria was occupied by the Kingdom of Benin. Its territory was once of great interest to London. Trade routes essential to the Royal Niger Company passed through the region. This company used to promote British interests in Africa and export some raw materials, cotton, nuts, and palm oil to Europe. The company would later become part of Unilever, the modern giant producing everyday goods from toothpaste to chocolate bars all over the world. Here's the Unilever headquarters, looking quite imperial by itself, located on the banks of the Thames. In 1897, British-Benin relations escalate over customs duties for British traders, leading to a bloody battle.
When a British official took it upon himself, it seems, to lead a small expedition to Benin, unarmed. His exact motives are not clear, but he was attacked and ambushed. He was killed. Several other British officials were killed. So, by the way, were dozens of porters and carriers, and they tend to get forgotten in this history. And that, if you like, forced the British, you might say shamed the British, into what was known as a punitive expedition. And so in February 1897, just 5 weeks later, a much larger force came, mobilized very quickly from Britain, from Cape Town, from Malta in the Mediterranean, a mixture of navy and soldiers, and they stormed Benin City, took it by force, sent the Oba, the king, into exile. He never saw his kingdom again, and his lands were incorporated into the expanding British protectorate.
They found a whole collection of about 4,000 valuable items that were later called the Benin bronzes. What is important is that the events in Benin were documented very carefully by the British themselves. Since this was late 19th century, there were many photographs among other documents.
During the invasion of the British in 1897, a lot of families were shattered. The society was fractured. Then colonialism brought its own harm to our language, to our culture, to our traditions, and to our way of life, which we see till today. For the people of Nigeria, the name bronze is an important symbol, a repository of our history, of our proud culture and traditions.
These tablets were taken from the walls of the royal palace in plundered Benin. The palace itself was also destroyed. Despite the name, most of the artifacts are not bronze, but brass and sometimes ivory. Indeed, very fine work. These images of the Oba, the local ruler, are especially notable here. You can recognize him by this special cap and these necklaces on his neck that completely covers it up to his chin. This was considered a sign of high nobility. Usually such tablets were made in honor of the deceased Oba, when a new one would come to power. The deceased was considered the patron of those who still remained in this world. The British Museum now possesses about 900 of these tablets. Many more were seized, but they have since been scattered around many museums in Europe. They ended up in the Netherlands, Germany, some of them ended up in America, but still the collection here in the British Museum is the largest. And as I said, along with the Parthenon marbles, this is the most obvious and clear textbook case of how art objects were simply stolen and brought to England without any consent from their owners. What kind of consent could there be if Benin was destroyed and annexed?
Well, the thing is, these bronzes were looted from the palace in the first place. And the palace is a public institution which is the symbol and the repository of our heritage.
Quite recently, in 2021, they began to return Benin bronzes free of charge as restitution. Cambridge University was the first to do that, by the way. There was student unrest there. As a result, the university returned a rooster figurine that had been on display in the dining hall at one of the colleges for a long time. Later in November 2022, the Horniman Museum in London handed over 72 items to Nigeria, including bronzes. In the same year, Germany returned 21 items it had been storing. But things went awry. The Nigerian president gave the received artifacts to a descendant of the Benin kings, Uwari II. So these items were not put on display for the public, but became someone's private property. And they may even be sold at auction. We have many questions for Nigeria after this story. Not a single bronze was returned there. What prompted England to expand worldwide in the first place?
Partly, it was due to the age of exploration. England was not the only country to expand here, and not even the first one. The Pyrenean countries, such as Portugal and Spain, had set this pan-European trend for discovering new lands and searching for a route to India and endless valuable resources, such as gold, of course.
Initially, it was Anglo-Norman conquest after the Norman invasion of England. The Anglo-Norman elite started to push into Wales and into Ireland. But really the first sort of organised, concentrated plan of colonisation overseas was in Ireland. And this was during the Tudor period under King Henry VIII, who deliberately devised a plan for plantations, as they were called. So this is the plantation, not just of seeds and plants, but of people, the wholesale movement of English people into Ireland to subdue it. So businesses were set up, companies, new companies, to take English and Scottish settlers to Ireland. And really that combined colonisation of Ireland by the English and the Scottish was what gave rise to a British identity, a new identity of Britons, not just English, not just Scots, not just Welsh, but Britishness was really forged on the anvil of Ireland in the act of colonising Ireland from the mid-16th century onwards. In the 17th century, early 17th century, that laboratory for colonisation in Ireland started to be a springboard for colonisation across the other side of the Atlantic as well, on the eastern seaboard of America.
In 1453, England finally lost the 100 Years' War to the French. London lost almost all of its possessions on the continent, which was a significant part of modern France and Belgium. At the same time, it lost the opportunity to take over the French throne. I don't mean London, but the English king, of course. They had been craving this for a long time, but they didn't succeed. The king had to think where he could redirect his desire to conquer new lands. In 1492, the answer came from this man who had nothing to do with England. This is Christopher Columbus, who discovered America. By the way, there's a monument to him on one of the most luxurious squares in London, Belgrave. The Spanish embassy is located there. Perhaps that is the reason why it is here. The British realized that they needed to discover new territories overseas. Spices were especially tempting. Pepper, cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon, ginger. Venetian merchants had been bringing them from Asia for quite a while along a long route through the Middle East and the Mediterranean. The English had wanted to take over this route and trade themselves. But Venice was a great power at that time. It had the most powerful fleet in the Mediterranean Sea, which was the most important waterway at that time. The idea to shake its monopoly on trade with the East seemed unrealistic. As you remember, this was the reason why Columbus went on his expedition. He was looking for another route to India, but he reached the Caribbean. They began to call them the West Indies back then. We will talk about this later. A sailor and merchant from Genoa, Giovanni Caboto, John Cabot, was among those who were trying to find a route to India sailing to the northwest. He came to England, to Bristol, in 1495 and received a patent from King Henry VII to explore and develop conquered lands on behalf of London. A year later, John Cabot, that was Giovanni's English name, sailed west on a small ship called the Matthew with a crew of 18 people. After an exhausting journey, they landed on an island, but we still don't know exactly which one it was. Most likely, it was the north of Newfoundland, which is in modern Canada. John Cabot called this island Terra Prima Vista, which literally means the first land that had been seen. Like Columbus, he believed he had discovered a route to India. He turned back to Bristol and brought good news, so they equipped him for a new expedition. He sailed to the same place again on 5 ships with 200 people, but all of them were lost at sea.
Was Columbus's expedition a success or failure?
Historically, that is a tricky question.
Right. That was a tricky question. He promised the kings of Castile that he would bring wealth, spices, and gold. Unfortunately, he failed to fulfill this promise. Cabot did not find gold. He did not find a way to the east, spices, and so on. But this sandbank near Newfoundland was discovered during his voyage, and cod fishing subsequently became an important source of income for the country.
Look at this warship right on the Thames. This is the HMS Belfast Museum that was used during the Second World War. You probably know that England is called the Mistress of the Seas, and the English fleet is the pride of England. This is a purely imperialistic history as well. In 1495, King Henry VII founded the first royal dock in Portsmouth. He died in 1509, and by that time, London already had 5 warships, 2 of which were 4-masted sailing carracks, much larger in size than the average merchant ship. The next English king was Henry VIII, who is famous for divorcing 2 and executing another 2 of his 6 wives. He also saw the Navy as the key to the country's defense. England built almost 50 ships at new shipyards. Those ships could carry many more guns on board than before, 20 heavy and 60 light guns. Another innovation was that they could fire a broadside when all the guns on one side of the ship fire simultaneously. Such ships fight in a line to maximize firepower. This is where the name, Ship of the Line, comes from, by the way. Of course, innovation is a costly affair. London tried indirect methods of earning money and fighting rivals.
So Spain and Portugal were carving out colonies in Central and South America and the Caribbean. England lacked the tax base and the financial base and the military power to challenge Catholic Spain and Portugal as England was becoming Protestant. And during these wars of religion and wars between monarchies within Europe, Elizabeth's option was to license, to give permission to privateers, men like Walter Raleigh and Francis Drake, to sail armed ships to the Caribbean and the Americas and to attack Spanish and Portuguese shipping.
In the middle of the 16th century, the Crown started issuing letters of marque. This was basically permission to capture and plunder ships belonging to hostile countries. They mainly belonged to Spain and Portugal. In other words, London legalized piracy, or to put it mildly, created naval PMCs. Elizabeth I's favorites, John Hawkins and Sir Francis Drake, were among the first to receive such letters of marque. They engaged in piracy, slave trade, and robbery within the law and on behalf of the Crown. They split the loot with the authorities. London had other interests besides financial ones. Firstly, pirates had been exploring new territories, which later became the basis for their colonization. Secondly, the constant plundering of merchant ships was weakening rival countries. And thirdly, the experience of such sea captains was a valuable asset for the development of the Navy. A win-win situation. In 1588, England clashed with Spain in the famous Battle of Gravelines with the English fleet commanded by Elizabeth's pirates. The English managed to defeat the invincible Spanish Armada. Why?
The Spaniards are still also operating galleys, which of course are particularly useful in the Mediterranean. They're less seaworthy when you start to come out into the North Sea or even into the Channel. So English ships were generally smaller and they're more easy to handle than the Spanish ships, I think. Spain is really, in many respects, a rather impoverished country in the 16th century. It was never capable, for example, of manufacturing its own cannon. It's slightly lucky in a way because there's what we call the Protestant wind. And of course, the wind changed at a particularly good moment in 1588.
Elizabeth's option was to give permission to privateers, men like Walter Raleigh and Francis Drake, to sail armed ships to the Caribbean and the Americas and to attack Spanish and Portuguese shipping on behalf of the Crown. And they got to keep some of the plunder that they could take, and the Elizabethan government got to wage a kind of proxy war against Spain and Portugal. So the English saw it as legitimate at the time because it was just a form of warfare against another enemy. But it laid the base for later colonisation of the Caribbean because already English ships were using ports and harbours and military fortifications in the region as a result of that piracy, and to enrich themselves regardless of any alliance or any permission from the Crown. So when they started attacking English ships as well, they were no longer licensed privateers. They were the pirates of the Caribbean in a traditional sense.
That happens with private military companies even now. We have had Prigozhin's riot just 2 years ago in Russia.
Yeah,
pretty much the same thing, maybe.
Yeah, they start off operating on behalf of the state, and then they become
the enemy of the state.
Yeah.
In 1583, England established its first overseas colony, the island of Newfoundland, the one where John Cabot had probably landed a century earlier. Humphrey Gilbert, the half-brother of another of Elizabeth's favorites, Sir Walter Raleigh, received a patent for the island's discovery and management. The Crown's plan was to make Newfoundland an outpost of English trade and a base for exploring America. Gilbert and 250 people sailed west on 5 ships. They were soldiers, sailors, and artisans. They organized the settlement of Fort St. John on the southern coast of Newfoundland. However, the attempt was unsuccessful. The colonists lacked everything except fish. The situation was complicated by the harsh climate, lack of knowledge about the local environment, and the local population. After a month, Gilbert realized that the colony was not successful. He decided to return to England, but on the way back, the fleet hit a strong storm and sank with most of the crew. The first Englishmen settled in the territory of the modern USA in 1585 on Roanoke Island, which is in North Carolina now, right here. By 1587, the group of colonists had about 115 people. The first American child was born there. Her name was Virginia Dare. However, the colony mysteriously disappeared without any trace soon. In 1587, the settlement's governor, John White, sailed to England to get supplies. When he returned, he did not find anyone, not a single living soul. The legend says the only thing he saw was that cryptic word Croatoan carved into the palisade. This was the name of the Indian tribe that lived on the same name island nearby. You can imagine what kind of bloody drama played out there.
Well, there are different theories about why this happened. But here's the most rational explanation. We actually know from the way the first Englishmen settled here in the 17th century. I mean, the famous Pilgrim Fathers on the Mayflower. According to the writings they'd left, it was a difficult undertaking, a foreign land, unfamiliar conditions. That's where Thanksgiving Day comes from. The Native Americans saved those newcomers. That's the first group of pilgrims.
That's where Thanksgiving Day comes from, right?
Yes.
When they eat turkey, right?
Yes, exactly. That's an American myth. This is how historical myths arise. We know that the first group of pilgrims, led by Bradford in Plymouth, the future Plymouth colony, had a very hard time there. The first winter was followed by disease and hunger. They did not know what to grow, how to grow food in this territory, and so on. The knowledge and help of local residents was an important factor of their success. Therefore, the fact that this very first colony that was founded in the 16th century in 1587 did not cope with these challenges. Does not sound strange, right?
The first successful colonies in North America are those 13 territories that later gave rise to the United States. Those were the colonies of New England, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. They became a refuge for the Puritan pilgrims. The Puritans were followers of a radical Protestant movement, Calvinism, and advocated for the complete strict cleansing of the Anglican Church from any remnants of Catholicism. As a result, they were so strict that they themselves were persecuted in England. So they migrated to America, arrived there on the ship called the Mayflower. Here it is. In 1620, they mastered agriculture, fishing, hunting, and began trading with the Indians. The middle colonies located to the south are New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. The first two were founded by the Dutch and the Swedes, but later they came under English control. You probably know that New York was initially called New Amsterdam. Thanks to its convenient port, it quickly became a very rich and successful city. This is Manhattan Island. The financial district is located here now. If you are interested, the Twin Towers were located somewhere around here. As you may know, the English bought New Amsterdam, as it was called back then, from the Dutch. Wealthier settlers seeking religious freedom usually preferred the middle colonies and the New England colonies. And here are the so-called tobacco colonies of Maryland and Virginia, with large plantations of tobacco. If any of you smoke, you may remember that Virginia tobacco is a kind of quality mark, even nowadays. And here are the southern colonies, Carolina, which later split into North and South Carolina and Georgia. They grew corn there, raised cattle and pigs, and by the end of the 17th century, they also began to grow rice here. Here's an important detail. The so-called indentured servants often settled in the southern colonies to work. These were poor Englishmen who were unable to pay for their voyage across the ocean. They would sign a contract with the company that owned the ship, so they were indentured. Under these contracts, they had to work off the money they'd borrowed to get a ticket. They were free, but still enslaved. A crucial event which still comes back to bite America again and again took place in 1619. The first consignment of slaves from Africa was brought here. Soon, they turned out to be such a profitable investment that they completely replaced indentured servants.
It was seen almost exclusively as simply an economic transaction. That, this was something, there's always been slavery in human history. Britons felt of themselves as not doing anything particularly morally wrong. They even used aspects of Christianity to justify enslavement.
Slavery was a universal institution, so was slave trading, practiced by people on every continent. Africans had been busy selling other Africans to the Arabs, in fact, to the Romans, first of all, and then to the Arabs, long before European merchants appeared on the coast of West Africa. So British involvement in slave trading and slavery was not unusual.
But all the time that they were developing this transatlantic trade, they were actually developing something that was unprecedented in human history, something that wasn't like previous practices of slavery. So in much of the ancient world, in much of the Arab world, and there had been a very large Arab slave trade already along the eastern side of Africa, but in much of that world, the capturing of people was so that they could provide domestic labour, military labour, conscripts, and be exploited for sex. The transatlantic trade was something quite different because it was emerging with the growth of this capitalist economy. African people became capital assets in a way that enslaved people previously in history hadn't. So you could leverage loans on the basis of the number of people you owned. They would be put to work and captured purely for commercial purposes, not to be domestic servants, not for other domestic roles.
It was really bad. If you actually drill down and look at the day-to-day existence of enslaved Africans, and that's really where I've done most of my research, it was what we call racial terror. because you are stripping somebody of their identity. You're stripping them of their rights, so they have no rights whatsoever. You're stripping them of any form of agency or control that they have, and you are making them subhuman. So Caribbean historians argue that transatlantic chattel slavery was worse than other forms of slavery, countering the argument of the apologists. So what makes them say it was worse? Well, if you look at what happened in places like Jamaica, it's shocking. It's so shocking, we can't even make films on it. You know, I've tried to make films on the BBC about the first 5 years of an enslaved person, and they've said, no, it's too shocking. Because if you take a fit warrior from West Africa, you capture him, and he's made it across the Atlantic, the Middle Passage, which is like a concentration camp at sea, packed in, brutalized, no space to move. They make it to the West Indies. How do you break in that warrior? You humiliate them, you dehumanize them, and you break them in such a way that they will become compliant. So they had things that they would do on the plantation to break in slaves. There's a diarist from Jamaica, Thistlewood. One of the things that he did was called Darby's dose. That's where you have one enslaved African shit in another enslaved African's mouth or piss in their eyes as a form of brutalizing them. Not only physical beatings and whippings, but also sexual assault. Male rape was a tool of empire, because how are you going to break these people in, humiliate them, break them down to nothing, and then remake them as slaves?
So really it was the transatlantic slave trade that enabled European powers, and particularly Britain, to embark on what's been called the Great Divergence, to move away from the standards of living that much of the world had had around 1600, and start to industrialise, to urbanise, and to become much more wealthy and much more powerful. Transatlantic slavery wasn't the only input to that. There was things like coal reserves, there was a political dispensation, security for money and so on, political institutions. But it was one of the ingredients. Slavery was one of the ingredients that enabled that very rapid takeoff of the British Industrial Revolution, the first industrial revolution in the world.
According to the ethical norms of that time period, was it considered normal, or did they start realizing that slavery wasn't a good idea?
Until the mid-18th century, it was normal. Starting with the second half of the 18th century, the abolitionist movement started in England, but it wasn't mainstream yet. The first trials took place in Britain in 1707. I should point out, England and Scotland had united as one kingdom. A unification happened. De jure, Great Britain was born.
United Kingdom.
Yes. Before the mid-18th century, there were attempts by slaves who resided in the British Isles. But court trials always confirmed the right to possess slaves. However, in 1772, the first unusual trial happened. One slave owner wanted to take his slave to Jamaica and sell them. With white abolitionist support, that slave sued their owner, and King's Bench, one of the highest courts in Great Britain, decided that nowhere in the English statutes did it say that one could limit an individual's freedom of movement against their will and just take them away from their home. English laws never allowed that.
So slavery existed within England, too.
There were about 14 or 15,000 slaves. Not too many. They mostly were servants, because black people, footmen, were a sign of status, or maids.
Were they also considered slaves?
Yes.
In 1765, Great Britain passed the Stamp Act, which required that all printed materials and documents be printed on special stamped paper. America saw it as another tax, especially since the colonists weren't represented in the British Parliament and didn't have a right to vote. The response was a movement called No Taxation Without Representation. They didn't obey the royal agents and destroyed the stamped paper or sent it back to London. In 1773, as a protest against the tariffs introduced by the Parliament, Sons of Liberty activists, an organization on the east coast of America, trespassed on British ships in Boston Harbor and threw crates with tea into the water. The incident is known as the Boston Tea Party. It's considered one of the precursors to the American Revolutionary War. In 1774, the colony's representatives met in Philadelphia at the Continental Congress, where they signed the Declaration and Resolves, and a year later, near the cities of Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts, the first shooting started. The colonists and the British troops that first arrived went into battle.
It's one of the problems was that, in a sense, you're fighting a population, as well as the Continental Army, which is raised by Congress. One factor was that the American Congress doesn't fight a war in the way that the British expect in terms of the financial aspects of it. Actually, American militias, colonial militias, are very, very significant in holding down particular areas. There's the environmental factors as well. It's not an easy country in which to fight. And particularly up in sort of the northeast, in the sort of forested areas of New York State and so on up there. And ultimately, Britain lost the population in a sense.
In 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed between London, which lost that war, and the colonies, which won it. England recognized the independence of the United States and established the new borders of America from the Atlantic to the Mississippi. The states evicted the British Empire to become a new global empire centuries later.
The position of the government of the time was expressed this way. The colonists must give in and recognize the supremacy of the Crown and the British Parliament, lay down the arms, and after that, the king will show mercy. Yeah, that's how it was. The colonists didn't want those conditions anymore. Besides, the rise of national identity was starting in the colonies. While the conflict was happening, the nation was born. In the course of those 13 years, the English colonists, the subjects of the English monarch,
turned into Americans.
They turned into Americans. Yes, they were the ones who started building their nation. There was a schism inside the colonies too. Not all colonists were ready to join the war for independence. After the war, after Britain recognized the 13 colonies' independence, around 100,000 people left those colonies.
Did they go back to England?
Some went to England, but most went either to Canada or to the West Indies.
You see, this is a place that floods when the Thames overflows. It looks as if we had been transported several centuries into the past. On the other bank is a very affluent district. It's called Canary Wharf Apartments. Flats are incredibly expensive there. Interestingly enough, it is indirectly connected with one of the most controversial periods of the British history, because at the beginning of the 18th century, there used to be docks here. Ships that came from the West Indies were unloading there. What is the West Indies? These are islands in the Caribbean, such as Barbados or Jamaica. They seemed like an attractive destination for London because tropical goods like sugar, tobacco, and coffee could be exported from there. Besides, it was an essential strategic outpost between Europe and the Americas. The West Indies produced from 80 to 90% of sugarcane that was consumed in Europe. The demand for sugar grew along with the popularity of tea and coffee. If, in 1700, Great Britain consumed about 2 kilograms per person, a century later, that figure rose to 8 kilograms. This period is controversial because who worked at plantations in the West West Indies in North America? Right, slaves, who were brought by the English from Africa. They say that out of 15 million slaves brought from Africa, no less than 2 million died on their way to the West Indies. Besides, some historians believe that the figures were understated on purpose, and the real number of slaves could be about 100 million individuals. London ended the transatlantic slave trade in 1807. In 1833, the British Parliament passed the Slavery Abolition Act, which freed slaves in the British colonies. Curiously, the West Indies economy, which was based on slavery, couldn't reach the same output as before.
Britain was one of the leading powers, abolishing its own slave trade in 1807, and then abolishing slavery in many of its colonies, not all of them, in 1833. What caused it? There's a whole host of reasons. One of them is about enslaved people's resistance. So the revolution in Haiti, San Domingo, in the 1790s, was the first abolition of slavery. So Britain wasn't the first power to abolish slavery. It was enslaved people themselves overthrowing French rule, killing many of the French planters, and declaring themselves free and declaring slavery abolished in Haiti. That was the first moment of abolition in this transatlantic slave form, the abolition of that form.
You go to the Guildhall in London, a major meeting place for business. There's a statue of Alderman Beckford from the 1800s. He was a slave trader, a mass murderer. At one point, he killed 400 enslaved Africans because they rebelled against him, but he was also Lord Mayor of London twice. And the reason why they built a statue of him in the 1700s, not the 1800s, sorry, in the 1700s, the reason why they built the statue was because he was critical of the king. And stood up for the city of London. So later on, when they wanted to valorize these slave owners and clean up or sanitize the history, they built a statue of him in the Guildhall.
You may have noticed that Robert's surname is also Beckford. The thing is, his ancestors worked on the plantation of William Beckford, that same slave owner. Slaves were often given their master's surname. It was a common practice at that time.
We have campaigned for this statue to come out, not just because he was a slave owner, but he was a mass murderer. Killed 400 people in 1760. That's not somebody you should be valorizing. So that's one example. There are not just statues, but also artifacts and installations that were paid for by slave owners.
See that amazing building right there? Reminds me of either the Centre Pompidou in Paris or a thermal power station of some kind. We're here for a reason, as in 1600, a group of English merchants asked Queen Elizabeth I for the right to monopolize Eastern trade. They were mostly interested in spices, silk, cotton, and porcelain. Nearly 200 merchants, led by the Earl George Clifford, invested in the endeavor. By that time, he had made a fortune through pirate raids. In December 1600, Elizabeth of England signed the charter creating the Company of Merchants of London trading to the East Indies. Later on, the company would change its name to the more concise East India Company. It would be known as one of the first ever multinational business organizations. So this is where the East India Company's head office used to be, on the site of this unusual building. It had some fairly good continuity. The EIC was run by a court of directors while the funds were invested by many privateers who expected surplus profits, and not in vain. According to the royal decree, the company, as requested, was granted a trade monopoly in the waters between the Cape of Good Hope and South America. That is, all the way from present-day South Africa to Chile. That's basically half the globe. Initially, the merchants planned to focus on the eastern part of the said region, the modern Philippines and Indonesia. But the Dutch and French, respectively, were about to colonize these areas, so the English could not compete with them. That's why the East India Company turned its gaze to India. In the 17th century, the Mughal Empire was located within the present borders of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and part of Afghanistan. The East India Company strikes a deal with its ruler, Jahangir, to establish a trading post in the city of Surat. Later on, similar posts were opened in Bombay, Madras, and here in Calcutta, cities to become key strongholds for the British conquest. It's not so much of a conquest, since there was no battle where the British won, defeated the locals, and established their military domination. It would rather be more of a gradual penetration into the government that will last several decades, a very tough and effective one.
At that time, they encountered an empire that was at its height. It was, in fact, in some ways, some would argue, the glory of the world. You know, you would have to compare it, what would be the comparable empires? None in Europe. None in Europe. It would be the Ottomans, it would be the Safavids, right? India, even under Aurangzeb, at least until the first half of his long reign of 40 years, right? India accounted for perhaps as much as 25% of the world's economy.
But you may be aware that in 1960s, 70s, a commission was established by the UNESCO to study the economic condition of the world and how was the GDP of different countries. Results were there. And it was all, participated by French, British, American, Russians, and all that. And they came to the conclusion that from AD 1 to 1800, in these 1800 years' time, India's GDP contribution to the world was 24% to 37%. But at 1800, when British arrived, India's contribution to GDP was 34%. So you can imagine how prosperous was India, how to compete in the world for a very high GDP, you not only need a very peaceful country, but also technologically very advanced.
In 1639, the EIC purchased land in southern India and built Fort St. George, located in Madras, now Chennai, the first English fort. Soon, similar defense buildings began to be erected all over India. Fort William, the fort in Calcutta, was laid out in 1696, and its old building used to be at this very spot where the General Post Office is now located, considered one of the finest gems of colonial architecture. Well, indeed, it is impressive. If you could make a bit more repairs, that would be great. But one must note the difficulties when it comes to the restoration of architectural objects in India. Particularly those that have to do with the British Empire are usually in such a shabby state. It's a bit like Cuba, where memories of old America remain. So here, too, are the memories of the British Empire. The construction of the fort was financed, of course, by the East India Company. As I mentioned earlier, its initial interest in India was purely commercial. But as they say, the more you have, the more you want. Like every corporation in the world, the East India Company was seeking two things: expansion and monopoly. Before long, it turned into a so-called private empire, which bribed numerous Indian emperors and had its own armed forces. Today, we call them PMCs, private military companies. It consisted of regular British officers and Indian mercenary soldiers called sepoys. In fact, the company was starting to turn into a Gazprom-like entity, since it became more than just a company and accessed more and more Indian treasures. On the other hand, it resembles PMC Wagner, since once its economic power gained momentum, its military force strengthened as well. By the mid-17th century, the EIC was responsible for almost half of all exports from India. It trades spices, silk, cotton, dyes, ammunition, glass, pottery, opium, and tea were also in the range of goods. It's easier to say what the company didn't trade rather than what it did. Such a success sparked concerns among the Mughals, so that by the late 17th century, the local authorities repeatedly turned down requests from the British people for further trade privileges. As soon as clashes began, the British seized ports and attacked the Mughal fleet. The latter were stronger at the first phase of the war, so London even had to regret and apologize for its actions at some point.
And when they came initially as traders, they essentially had to pay their obeisance. They had to pay their respects and essentially bow down before the Mughal emperor because they were nothing in comparison to the Mughal emperor. Now, your question really is, how did they evolve from being traders to becoming rulers? So some of the answers that we can think about are, one, that the Indians were not united. This is the favorite theory, of course, that the Indians have, that had we been united as a people, okay, we wouldn't have permitted this kind of encroachment. Of course, this begs the question, well, how do we achieve a kind of unity? Because unlike England, where the vast majority of the population all spoke English, in India, there was no common language, and there still isn't today. You've got dozens of major languages, right? And why is unity so desirable? In any case, that's a different question, right? But that's one favorite answer that is generally given, I would say, by lots of people, not just historians, but I would say common people, that we were never united.
By the mid-18th century, the War of the Austrian Succession kicked off in Europe. The death of Emperor Charles VI was followed by several countries trying to contest his will and claim the Habsburg inheritance. There emerged two opposing alliances, Russia and Great Britain versus France, Austria, and Russia. Winston Churchill would later label the 7 Years' War as the First World War. At the time, it was underway even in North America, where France built a series of forts in the Ohio River Valley, marking the border between British and French territories. At the time, the 13 colonies were still under London's control, and the metropolis itself perceived the construction of forts as a threat to their interests. In 1759, the British won the Battle of Quebec and expelled French troops from what is known today as Canada. Under the Treaty of Paris concluded in 1783, France renounced its territorial claims east of the Mississippi to Britain. The fight between London and Paris also bled into Asia. By the middle of the 18th century, India's territory had been divided into zones of influence between French and English trading companies. Naturally, each of them strived to get rid of each other. Both sides followed the principle of divide and rule. That's why they bribed the leaders of various principalities, which there used to be a lot of. They turned them against each other by forming so-called subsidiary alliances. This led to local governors giving away the right to pursue foreign policy primarily to the English. The governors were also to pay a military funding tax for self-defense. In the beginning, it was more like racketeering, but later it transformed into what we know today as forced abandonment of sovereignty. If a principality refused to obey, it would be annexed. Here's a typical anecdote from the war that showcases the English methods. In 1756, Siraj-ud-Dawla became the head of Bengal. He preferred to cooperate with the French and demanded that the English stop fortifying Fort William in Calcutta, which the English refused to do. Soon enough, a military clash followed, with the English and French fighting in the Battle of Plassey in West Bengal. The joint Bengalese and French forces noticeably outnumbered the English, but local disagreements and the English habit of making deals came into play. The Bengalese were led by Mir Jafar, whom the British talked into making a good deal. He switched sides and supported London, getting the Nawab position in exchange. The French were defeated while Britain gained control over Bengal. It was the Battle of Plassey that marked the beginning of Britain's conquest of India. In 1760, they once again won a victory over France in the Battle of Wandewash. In 1761, Britain also won the Battle of Pondicherry, England's main checkpoint in India. By the end of the 7 Years' War, the British Empire became the world's biggest colonial power. At the same time, the British government here in India began to further interfere with the East India Company's affairs. Why? Nowadays, we see the same pattern. States don't like it when when a new sideline state emerges inside them, with its own army and income that is almost bigger than the official income, as well as its own influential leader. In 1773, the government introduced the position of the Governor-General of India. He was to be appointed by London, with his residency located here in Calcutta in Fort William. That would automatically strip the East India Company of the majority of its privileges. This is a very important building. It used to be one of the control centers of British India at the end of the 18th century. It's called the Writers' Building because initially it was supposed to be an office for clerks or writers who worked for the administrative branch of the East India Company. The Writers' Building is believed to be the first three-story building in Calcutta. It's also the right place to elaborate on what the British Empire's main power was. Why was it able to conquer India so efficiently when India was a highly developed and highly cultured state in the times of the Mughals?
Some people talk about the fact that England went through an industrial revolution, but that was after 1740, 1750. Okay? And certainly it is a case that that's a factor, because we know that with the Industrial Revolution, we know that England was now a country that had become the leader, not just in Europe, but the leader all over the world, right? The Industrial Revolution didn't just create a middle class and create something called consumption, okay, which is part of the story of humanity today, that we are all consuming beings. What the Industrial Revolution required was a way of thinking about the world where the human being is a cog in the machine. Now, I think that there we begin to get to some of the essence of why the British triumphed. In order to have colonialism, you have to begin to think of people as cogs in the machine. To some extent, you have to dehumanize people.
The machinery of big and small cogs that were low-level and high-level officials, they solved a variety of problems. They supported the work of all those huge and sophisticated devices any empire needs when it's expanding and conquering more and more territories. The bureaucracy, which this red building was constructed for, turned out to be very advanced and effective for its time. Why? Because at the time of India's conquest, it was in private hands. You do remember that it was the East India Company. In matters like these, a privately owned corporation is always more efficient than the government, simply because it's managed more effectively. That's why the British Crown later decided to put an end to the East India Company, taking all that smooth-running machinery, absorbing it into itself, and making it a state bureaucracy. It's not a coincidence that this building was repainted red, because British soldiers and officers wore red uniforms. Red was the color of the British Empire. Initially, it was painted white or beige and looked pretty frugal. There were no decorations. But legend has it that, back in the 19th century, one of the British peers, Lord Valentia, allegedly came to India and saw this and a few other colonial buildings. He was so dissatisfied with the look of them that he wrote to the directors of the East India Company, stating that India should be ruled from a palace, not an auditing chamber, by a prince, and not by a merchant. That's when the building was repainted and decorated with all these imperial elements.
So that is where I was coming. You take over the charge when it was 34%. After 150 years, you leave it at 1.8%. In what way did the British help? Did they not fleece Indian gradually, village to, district to state? And this is British document and also accepted by UNESCO by General Physical Survey. India's literacy rate in 1800 was, and actually 1837 British report is there, India's literacy rate was 87%. 87%. Britain and France's literacy rate was 7%. These are all data given by British themselves. Now the thing is, why was such a great literacy rate in India? Because in India, education was free. When British left in 1947, their own record, again I'm saying their own record, India's literacy rate has come down to 7%. Why? Free education was abolished. All grants that were free from any kind of tax to the schools and colleges, they were all withdrawn, cancelled. So if somebody thinks that British have contributed to India's thing, I don't know how they contributed.
So what did they do in Bengal, to go back to your question? One of the things they put into place is what is called the permanent settlement. So what was a permanent settlement? The permanent settlement involved a way of thinking about Indian agriculture and Indian landlords. Let's say 10 acres of land. So they take a date, 1790, let's say what was the revenue at that time? That is the amount that the landlord is supposed to deliver to the local ruler. Okay, now in this case, it's going to be the British. Okay, let's say the monsoon season has been very good and you have a bumper crop one year and another year. The farmer is actually making a lot of money because he's still paying that revenue at the fixed rate that was set. But let's look at the reverse. What is the reverse picture? The reverse picture is he still has to pay that revenue if there's a drought. You have 3 years of drought. The farmer is still required to pay that. And if he cannot pay it, the British acquired the right to possess the land. This is what in Marxist vocabulary is called the alienation of land. You take it from the person and you put it on the free market and you give it to the highest bidder. So what the British are saying is, essentially, is, to answer your question, is they're saying we're going to create a class of landlords who can be secure in their wealth. This wealth will never be appropriated by the British state in India, right? And they'll have an incentive to improve their property, because if they know if they can improve it, they'll get a better crop, they'll become richer. The other side of it is that the majority of these people actually lost their land because they couldn't meet the revenue demand. A large number of people who now are going to become landless. That's one illustration. Let's take another illustration. I'll give it in much shorter description. The British claimed that their rule had yielded enormous benefits and dividends.
Infrastructure, mainly.
Yeah. And what do? They give an account of their glorious achievements, particularly infrastructural, irrigation canals, this and that. Well, what they don't tell you is, and I think that this is unquestionably true, I think there's a massive amount of documentation about it, is that in India, under British rule, famines happened repeatedly. And in fact, from 1875 to 1925, that's 50 years, half a century, that period is a period that I have described in my writings as a period of catastrophic death. Because by my calculation and the calculation of a number of other historians, about 100 million excess deaths took place in India at that time. 100 million excess deaths. So we're talking about beyond the normal mortality. What accounts for them? Plagues, epidemics, famines. South India, 1890s, early 1900s, 20, 30 million people just die like fleas. Just die like fleas. And what's extraordinary is that British rule started with famines and ended with famines.
Now you know that the typical argument of the English left good infrastructure is easily countered by the fact that they built that infrastructure for themselves. Same applies for the majority of the architecture left behind, like St. Paul's Cathedral in Calcutta. This was the first Anglican church in this city, or maybe even in the whole of India. It bears an obvious resemblance to Westminster Abbey. It's located in an area that was exclusively populated with white people, the English, during the colonial period. Locals were allowed to enter the premises only if they were servants.
British rule was justified by this idea that they were civilizing Indians, that British power was fundamentally liberal, modernizing, progressive, that they were teaching Indians in schools how to speak English, how to govern more effectively, that they were bringing infrastructure to India, like railways.
Railroads.
Yeah, exactly, railways, towns, cities, a postal service, the educational system, a civil service that they were building in India. So the rhetoric was always a benevolent paternalism, that they would guide Indians so that they could become as advanced, as civilized as Britain was. And the promise always held out was that once we've done our job, once we've brought you up to our level, we'll leave you to it. But in practice, that promise was always put off and put off again and again and again. You're not quite ready yet.
Just as in any difficult situation like this, it always comes as a package. Of course, development and new things can be good, but they inevitably bring some changes, which aren't necessarily positive. Again, we often judge from a modern point of view, but back in those days, people had a different perspective. They often considered themselves to be the bearers of civilization and thought they were developing and enhancing the culture of the country. But they didn't notice that they were adapting it to themselves and creating copies of their own life and civilization in a place where people had their own. Ideally, it should always be some kind of symbiosis, some kind of hybrid approach. And they should be creating something new rather than imposing what they're familiar with. This is what's often criticized. But on the other hand, people forget these things, consciously or not. In India and Pakistan, for example, cricket became a national sport. And it's perceived as something positive and is rarely criticized.
What other visible heritage has modern India inherited from the British Empire? Sports. The most popular sport here is cricket, clearly an English invention, football and golf. Of course, golf is the sport of elites, but there are a lot of elites here too. This is Kolkata, a rich city with a lot of rich people, and their presence is very noticeable. As in any country with no middle class, there is only the rich and the poor, so the upper class is always noticeable. Now we're going to meet one of these rich Indians and his family. They have owned mines and factories for 3 generations now and supply mica to Russia, among other things. Incidentally, all these factories used to belong to the British.
In the middle of the 20th century, your family bought several companies from the British, is that correct?
Yeah. My grandfather was involved in the stock exchange in Calcutta, the share bazaar as we call it. So at that time, the British were leaving this country and they were very desperate to sell off their companies. So first he bought this company for mica.
And then you took over?
We took over the management at that time, but for 20 years they were all international sales was through them. Domestic sales was with us.
What does your company do now?
We are into we are into mining and export of industrial minerals. That's our main activity. And basically, my family has been involved in all kinds of minerals.
How, in general, do you feel now about the colonial period?
Mixed bag. I mean, given the fact that we talk in English, so this is one of the parts of the British heritage. So, yes, there were some things which the British did which were pretty good, which were the railways, for that matter. Though, it's said that the British mostly built up the railways because to transport materials which they wanted to export to UK or to England, and that's why they built the railways. But for whatever reason they built it, it has been a plus in this country. The second thing is that there was always a concept of India as a nation state. but something akin to something like a European identity. Like you have a European identity, you had an Indian identity. They were not specifically one large country. You know, it was never under, one whole country was never under one rule. So the British did that. They formed, all the different, they centralized the power in India. So now you have a more cohesive country. So that's for sure. That's the plus part of the British rule. But then at the same time, British rule was quite negative in the way that it really impoverished the people here. What you see today, the impoverishment in India, is like we have been trying to getting over the colonial period, but really it's a major task, because when the British left from here, India could not even feed itself.
This is why it's so complicated. The empire was never just one thing, and Britain's never acted in any one way. There were always conflicts and tensions between British colonists about what the empire was for and what Britain should be doing in their empire. So during the late 19th century, the period that Trump often now looks back on as America's golden age of tariffs and of taking over territory if you want it, Greenland, Canada, Panama, this was the era in which the American government was acting like a British or European imperial power, and it was starting to colonize the Philippines. There was much sort of anti-imperial sentiment in America that was saying this is wrong. This is not what America was founded to do. America was founded through the overthrow of an oppressive authoritarian empire. We were founded supposedly as a democracy, with democratic liberal values. So we shouldn't be doing this kind of imperialism. And Kipling was intervening in that debate by saying to Americans, no, you go ahead, you colonize like we did, because what you're doing is a duty, it's a responsibility.
Burden.
Exactly. You've got to pick up and shoulder the white man's burden. And the white man's burden is to civilize black people and people of colour. This is the justification that Britain had been propagating, many Britons have been propagating ever since the end of slavery, effectively. And it was a justification that American authorities at the time were very willing to take on as well. So again, you've got that hypocrisy, saying one thing, doing another thing, talking about liberal democratic values at home, but certainly not overseas.
I'll share more background on Kipling and this poem. The life of this man is closely connected with British colonial history. He was born in Bombay, now Mumbai, to an Englishman who came to India to teach at a local art school. At the age of 16, Rudyard got a job at a newspaper in Lahore, India, and traveled a lot around the country. Then he came back to Britain and became the first English language author to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. People of my generation, and I myself, mostly know Kipling as the author of Rikki Tikki Tavi, the short story about a valiant mongoose. And I'll have to admit that most of my youth I considered him to be an author of stories about animals like Vitali Bianchi, which was, of course, a huge mistake, because Kipling was a real British imperialist. And speaking in modern terms, he was a real racist. He wrote about the British Empire in purely positive and uplifting terms, and called the colonized peoples children and savages, less developed than white Europeans. His views were forever commemorated in the most important poem of the imperial period. It is called The White Man's Burden. It was written in 1899 about the Philippine-American War. Kipling exhorts Americans to annex the Philippines, explaining that it would only benefit the natives and that it is the white man's duty to educate and control the stupid and savage natives. Here's how it goes. Take up the white man's burden. Send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new-caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child, and so on.
He's an unabashed imperialist. Let's be very clear about that. But his personal history is much more complex. It's partly more complex because, beginning with his father, he had deep roots in India. Deep roots in India, and we'd have to go over his life history in considerable detail to understand the various ways in which he felt traumatized back in England. He was far more comfortable in India in many ways. See, because in England, people like him people from his class background, where do they go? To school. They go to boarding schools. And what are boarding schools? These English boarding schools are basically places where boys learn to bully each other. And you learn certain codes of masculinity, hyper-masculinity, I would say. Now, he felt very uncomfortable with that because he was a person who grew up in India and knew the cultural milieu here. So in some ways, he's a very troubled person. It is precisely because he understands that in many ways, India, in fact, may be far more superior, that he then comes out with vengeance to espouse the glory of Britain.
As you know, the British Army in India was made up of British officers and Indian mercenaries, the sepoys. By the mid-19th century, resentment was building up among the latter. Many did not approve of the exploitation in general and the British interference in local traditions in particular. In 1857, a rumor spread through the troops that the East India Company was going to introduce new cartridges that came pre-greased in a mixture of beef tallow and pork lard. To load the rifle, the soldiers would have to bite the cartridge open. This was offensive to both Hindus, who consider the cow to be a sacred animal, and Muslims who can't eat pork. The troops saw this as a sign of ostentatious disrespect on the part of the East India Company and Britain as a whole. On May 10, 1857, 87 sepoys refused to carry out an order to conduct firing practice with the new cartridges and were sentenced to death. Although the sentence was later reduced to 10 years of hard labor, the discontent could not be stopped. A rebellion broke out. Tens of thousands of sepoys attacked their British officers. Many came here to the Red Fort in Delhi, then to the residence of the London loyal Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah, and asked him to lead a protest movement, in effect, to lead an uprising. Unlike his predecessors, Bahadur Shah no longer had any real power. He received a salary from the East India Company and wrote poetry in his spare time. Later, at his trial, he would say that he did not want to participate in the rebellion, but was forced to. Either way, he joined the rebels, led them, and his sons took up officer posts in the Sepoy army. The East India Company, as we remember, relied on loyal units of local troops, mainly on people from other ethnic groups. As we remember, India was a fragmented country. Some troops were also transferred from the metropole and from Southeast Asia. In September 1857, imperial forces captured, looted, and destroyed the Red Fort. Bahadur Shah was exiled to Burma, modern-day Myanmar, and the 350-year-old Mughal Empire finally fell. An estimated 6,000 of the 40,000 Europeans in India were killed in the uprising. Up to 800,000 Indians fell victim, including those who died on the battlefield and those who died soon after from hunger and epidemic. Moreover, the uprising caused widespread destruction, and the Indian governmental debt increased from 60 to 100 million pounds sterling.
It was the last big attempt to overthrow the British. I want to insist on the fact it was not the only. Right? Most history books, particularly those written outside India, speak only of the 1857 rebellion. There was a history of these revolts and jacqueries, from 1757 onwards until 1857. But what is the singularity of 1857-58? What is its fundamental importance? It's the last great rebellion. Crushed this rebellion. There is a fundamental rearrangement in the way in which the British would govern India. The East India Company is abolished officially. The 1857-58 rebellion was brutal. There was brutality on both sides. Brutality on both sides. One of the things that the English did, and again, it's all documented. In fact, it was reported at that time. When they captured Indian rebel soldiers, they would tie them to cannon, and then they would put in the ammunition, and what would happen? The explosive would go through the cannon and the body would fly into the air and break up into hundreds of pieces. It was to show the Indians who's the master, right? This is what I mean by brutality. The Indians committed some acts of brutality too, but again, we should bear in mind that it's the British who are claiming to be the superior moral civilization. They're the ones who are claiming that the reason we rule you is because we represent a superior moral civilization. And in history, the superior moral civilization prevails over those who are morally inferior. Lots of other words were used too, people who are primitive, people who are barbarians or savages. But let's not use those words. They're simply claiming that we represent a superior moral civilization, because otherwise, how does one explain the fact that we, coming from a small island over there, are essentially thousands kilometers away, and we're just a very small number of people. We're governing over one of the most complex civilizations that's ever existed in history.
The British and all whites in general have always been extremely cruel when suppressing mutinies in their colonies. There are several reasons for this. First of all is their military personnel. Military recruits are not the most humane people, and they aren't exactly the creme de la creme either. They treated the local population as barbarians, treacherous savages, and so on, as in North America, let's say. That's the first thing. Secondly, they were afraid because whites were a minority. They were scared that the majority could rebel and take them down. So, it was necessary to teach them a lesson, so that no one dared to try it again. That's how you can explain this cruelty.
After 18 months of intense fighting, the rebellion was crushed. London believed that the East India Company had failed to deal with the situation, and it was dissolved in 1858. The Crown assumed direct control of India, the British Raj. The Governor-General of India from then on held the title of Viceroy. In 1876, Queen Victoria assumed the title of Empress of India. Her memorial hall, erected at the very beginning of the 20th century, still stands in the center of Kolkata. And here's a curious fact. It houses Vereshchagin's painting, The Prince of Wales at the Jaipur Procession. How did works of the famous Russian battle painter Vasily Vereshchagin end up in India? Very few people know that in 1874 to 76, he spent 2 years in this country, traveled a lot, and painted more than 150 paintings, not only of battles, but also many everyday scenes, ceremonial paintings, and simple sketches. Of course, he had heard many stories about the brutally suppressed Sepoy rebellion. One of his works depicts the scene of an execution of rebels by blowing from a cannon. This is the painting. Its original actually disappeared. They say it's been sold, and if it does still exist, it's part of someone's private collection. As for the Prince of Wales at the Jaipur Procession, it ended up in the Queen Victoria Memorial Hall in Calcutta, still perpetuating the ceremonial side of the British Empire.
India, being a crown colony, the queen at that time, who was Victoria, right? She's going to be Empress of India. Not officially, by the way. That happens under Disraeli. And in this case, her people means the Indians. That you are my people. I'm going to treat you because you're my people, and I'm not just the Empress of the United Kingdom, I'm Empress of India. I'm the queen for all of you. And I'm going to treat you exactly the same way I treat my subjects back in the United Kingdom. Of course, that was not the case at all, not even remotely, right? Because, for example, let's just take a simple test. If a British committed an official, could this person be tried by a jury of Indians? The answer is no. Absolutely no.
You name me any 400-year-old state, that wasn't cruel sometimes toward its subjects. You need to remember the British Empire lasted, as I say, from 1550 roughly to 1960, 400 years. It stretched from Newfoundland in Canada to New Zealand in Australasia. So the British Empire was many different things at different times. It was even different things at the same time. It was even different things at the same time in the same place. Different people behaved different ways. Was it sometimes cruel? Did it sometimes use unjustifiable violence? Did it sometimes exploit subject peoples? Yes, it did. But in those respects, it doesn't, Julia, it doesn't differ from any other long-standing historic state. What you can say of the British Empire is that it improved. Particularly in the course of the 19th century and 20th century, it became more humanitarian and more liberal.
Yeah, India's a big place, not as big as Russia. It's a pretty big place. Empire was different things in different parts of the day. Say in 1921, and you were a Sikh man in the Punjab, in the morning, a British officer might have helped you. He might have helped you sort out a dispute with your neighbour. And the same day, you might not have got into a hotel because of your skin colour, because of a British policy. So in one day, empire could be extremely different. Yeah, it was probably one of the most famous incidents in the history of the British Empire. If you've seen the film Gandhi, you've probably seen a dramatisation of it. But General Dyer, this is towards, I think, the end of World War I. General Dyer was a British officer who turned up at this park in Amritsar, believing that there were a lot of people there protesting against British rule. Actually, they were just people who had turned up for a religious event who were just in the park. They weren't particularly political. And he turned up with an armoured car, and he began shooting at this crowd. And even when it was obvious that they weren't political or weren't resisting, he shot them some more. It was so controversial that even Winston Churchill at the time described it as monstrous. And Winston Churchill was a big fan of the British Empire. And some people say this was the point at which the British lost India, because it created so much anger. It really galvanized people like Gandhi and Nehru, who then eventually overthrew the British Empire.
This is one of the numerous monuments to one of modern India's main heroes, a fighter for its independence, Mahatma Gandhi. In 1885, the first Indian political party, the Indian National Congress, was formed here. At first, it was intended as an opposition obedient to the British Crown, but by the 1920s, it started an active fight for independence from Britain. It happened partly due to the growth of a class of educated Indians, a lot of whom were fluent in English and had even studied in England. One of the young Indians who had studied in London was Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. Later, he was globally known by his nickname Mahatma, which meant great-souled in Sanskrit. He was born in a city called Porbandar in northwestern India to a family of Vaishya merchants, the lowest in the high castes. This part is important. His father was a city minister, so he was part of the elite. And as any child of the elite who has finished school, he could choose, or rather his parents could choose, so they sent him to London, just like today's rich parents do all the time. After he was done with his studies in 1891, Mahatma went to work to South Africa, where he spent more than 20 years. This period was formative for him as a politician. In South Africa, he faced the problem of racial discrimination head-on. We have a long documentary about South Africa's history on our channel, about the apartheid regime and how it all worked there. Gandhi resented how immigrants from India were treated, so he founded the South African Indian Congress in order to fight against segregation of Indians using peaceful protest. I should point out that at that moment, he was defending only Indians' interests. He wasn't trying to stop segregation as a whole. Nevertheless, the important part is that protest was peaceful. That became Gandhi's signature, his main idea and his main strength. He was a arrested a couple of times in Africa and then released after citizens exerted pressure. Over time, his name became known beyond South Africa, and in 1915, he returned to India and joined the Indian National Congress. Several years later, he became its leader. At that time, a tragic episode occurred, and as it happens with revolutionary movements, it was a trigger. In Amritsar, a holy city for Sikhs, a massacre took place. On 13th April 1919, British soldiers started shooting at a crowd of unarmed protesters. According to British sources, about 400 people died. According to Indian information, around 1,000. There were twice as many wounded. The country was about to catch fire. But let's remember Gandhi's main idea, a non-violent protest. It wasn't about attacking the occupiers. They were perceived as occupiers at that time already, with weapons, but about refusing to collaborate with British authorities, for example, and boycott British goods. One of the fight's most memorable episodes was commemorated on this monument. At the beginning of 1930, Great Britain monopolized the production and selling of salt. Keep in mind that salt production was an integral part of traditional husbandry. So, in March 1930, a small group led by Gandhi left Ahmedabad and headed to the seashore, to the village of Dundee, where salt was usually produced. The group grew larger and larger on its way. It ended up being thousands of people, almost like in Forrest Gump. Upon arriving in the village, Gandhi boiled a little bit of salt from sludge and broke the salt law. Millions of Indians followed his example in other cities. Time, already a pretty liberal magazine for the period, made Mahatma Gandhi the Person of the Year in 1930 and compared the Salt March with the Boston Tea Party. I'll remind you that Time is an American magazine. They had their own grudges against the Brits. So Gandhi was already a hero in America. After the protest, he was obviously arrested along with 60,000 people. He spent a year and a half in prison, but the peaceful protest was successful. Despite the salt tax not being canceled immediately, British authorities realized the independence movement was no joke, and they needed to make concessions.
Join him, and then when he breaks the salt law, hundreds of thousands of them broke the salt law. Technically, they're all breaking the law. And the British had to imprison 200,000, 300,000 people. He has essentially brought the empire to its knees. This is what Satyagraha does. Well, the word is a neologism, meaning that Gandhi coined the word. He invented the word. It's comprised of two words, Satya and Agraha. Okay? And so by the rule of combination, what's called sandhi, you combine them and it becomes one word. Simply translated as truth. It's more complex than that, as I'll illustrate very briefly. Okay? Satya is truth. What is agraha? Force. Satyagraha means truth force or soul force. That's another translation of the word satya. Satyamev jayate. Truth alone triumphs. Okay?
Getting back to Mahatma Gandhi's story, on 30th January 1948, here in Delhi, on the premises of his residence, he was shot by an Indian nationalist. He belonged to a Hindu group that believed that Gandhi was too lenient towards Muslims and was very careless when it came to the partition of India and Pakistan. Gandhi's body was cremated. His mausoleum is a seminal national symbol. Millions of people visit it. He's a national hero, the founder of the state in many ways. But interestingly enough, not everyone in India treats him as a deity or a demigod because the rich people, who thought they were always right, were against the idea of taking everything from the rich and giving it to the poor. So they believe that Gandhi was too left-leaning. They do acknowledge his contribution to India's liberation, but they believe that there were different sides to this person, and it wasn't so one-sided.
I feel, of course, Gandhi was, in a way, he got us freedom without so much bloodshed. But then again, what I feel is that, yes, Gandhi definitely was a great man, but I think the history in this country, the way it has been projected, is very unidimensional. It has just concentrated on Gandhi as a figure, or the Congress Party as one this thing. There has been no, let us say, recognition of other factions or other parties or other groups which fought for independence, and some of them not always non-violently. One of the reasons the British actually decided to leave in a hurry. I mean, they left in a hurry after the Second World War. They, in fact, brought closer the period of Indian independence, was because there was a mutiny in the Royal Navy in Bombay, and when there was just a handful of several thousand British officers controlling the whole of Indian Army and the Indian Navy. And most of the people were all Indians. So if there was a mutiny, they could not have controlled it. So they just said, better go away from here.
Were there many families here in India who took part in the World War II in Europe?
Not in the affluent part, no. Mostly people from, who took part in World War II were people basically who were lured by money by the British. In the First World War, in the Second World War as well. I mean, truly nobody was fighting for the King Emperor, so...
There are memories of a huge famine here in India.
Yes, the Bengal famine was horrible. More than 3 million people died. So when you speak about British rule, I think that's a big blot on British rule in India.
And it happened during the World War II?
Yes.
Because of the war itself, because of the crop has been found?
No. Yeah, exactly. The British started to, buy up a lot of grain here and export it from here, and did not care for the people here, especially the poor over here. And people were dying on the streets of Calcutta. So it's, horrendous. It was horrendous. I mean, I'm told, of course.
So this is the blot.
Big blot. Very big blot.
3 million Indians died during World War II. The largest loss of life during World War II on the Allied side was in India. And we just don't talk about it. 3 million people. It's not just that the British don't talk about it. Even Indians don't really talk about it. There's not a single commemoration of those 3 million people anywhere in the world. And there's very complicated reasons for that. Some people blame Winston Churchill, but actually I think it was a deeply complicated issue. I find it really interesting that you go to Parliament Square in London and there's a statue to Winston Churchill, obviously a great hero, but also a massive defender of imperialism. And right next to him nearby is a statue of Gandhi, who took on Winston Churchill. And Winston Churchill had nothing particularly nice to say about Gandhi. But sometimes it's said that British people aren't capable of confronting their dark history. But we have built a statue to the man who brought down the Raj and arguably helped to bring down the British Empire. So we do have it within us to face up to this history. But Gandhi was an amazing, inspiring man who, through peaceful means managed to expose the moral problems with the empire, and so much so that the British eventually legged it. But Nehru was the man who did the politics afterwards, who came in and tried to make the independent India work. But actually now, interestingly, the current Prime Minister of India is quite down on Nehru. He talks about himself as being the first true leader of modern India. And his argument is, look, all the leaders before me, or most of them, were educated in Britain or had some British education. And Nehru was a very Anglophile. He spoke in a very English way. I think he'd been to Oxbridge, and he supposedly had a relationship with the final Viceroy's wife. And so he's a very, establishment English character. Modi comes along and says, actually, no, it's me. I'm the first truly independent Indian leader.
As the Indian National Congress, INC, grew in popularity in the region, so did another political actor, the All India Muslim League, AIML, led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, which advocated the creation of a separate Muslim nation. Hindus wanted to form a secular state where both religious communities would have a voice. However, Muslims feared that in this case the state would be completely Hindu-led. As soon as continuous rallies and a tough financial situation prompted London to negotiate independence, the Governor-General of India, Louis Mountbatten, proposed to divide the country into two parts, namely, the Union of India, which was a Hindu-majority state, and Pakistan, dominated by Muslims. There were many Indian principalities allowed to choose which nation they would be a part of. Nevertheless, this turned out to be very difficult in practice. Mountbatten's plan implied one major condition. Indeed, those states were given to India or Pakistan. But what if they found themselves within the borders of either of the two emerging countries? They were annexed so as not to become an enclave, no matter what the demographic composition was. It's easy to see what kind of time bomb it was concerning future relations between the new states. As the country was divided into India and Pakistan, difficulties arose with the northern principalities of Junagadh, Jammu, and Kashmir. The Junagadh authorities chose to join Pakistan, although land-wise the principality was inside India. India disagreed with this, claiming that Junagadh's population was 96% Hindu, so it cut off fuel and coal supplies, disrupted postal services, and deployed its army. Eventually, the region became part of the state of Gujarat in India. But things got more complicated with Jammu and Kashmir. 77% of the population there was Muslim, but local Maharaja Hari Singh was willing to maintain independence. Neighboring countries weren't pleased with this. On the night of July 22, 1947, Pakistani-backed Pashtun tribesmen invaded the state and announced the creation of Kashmir free from Pakistani rule. The Maharaja turned to India for help. The dispute escalated into a severe international conflict. Battles last until 1949, when a peace treaty grants India control of the Kashmir Valley and most of Jammu and Kashmir province, whereas Pakistan acquires the western parts of the state, not to mention the territory called Azad Kashmir, literally translated as Free Jammu and Kashmir. Since then, India and Pakistan have fought over Jammu and Kashmir up to this day. This dispute is still unresolved and is seen as one of the hottest spots in the world. We can observe occasional clashes between the two populations, terrorist attacks, and global military clashes. As of now, the number of casualties totals tens of thousands. Here you can see the India Gate in Delhi, considered one of the landmarks of India. It was built in the 1930s to commemorate Indian soldiers killed in World War I, but it's also a monument to those who died in conflicts with Pakistan. Behind the gate, there is Amar Jawan Jyoti, the tomb of the unknown soldier, which was opened in the 1970s by Indira Gandhi, former and quite eminent PM of India, not to be confused with Mahatma Gandhi. So this very grave is dedicated to those soldiers who died honorably in wars with Pakistan. But this whole story has such a wonderfully exciting scene. You may have seen how, before the India-Pakistani border closing every day, there is this bizarre ritual, something between a march and a dance. Why exactly is the conflict between India and Pakistan considered so dangerous? Because these two are now nuclear powers, so any war between them could potentially break out into World War III, a very deadly regional conflict. And many people here believe that these relations are also a legacy of the British Empire.
What is the situation today? One Pakistan got divided into two countries, Pakistan and Bangladesh. In India, there are more Muslims than in Pakistan. Problem has come back to same where it was. Meaning thereby simple, that it was a simply bad idea to divide the country. It should have remained one, or else, if the division takes place, Gandhi says, oh, we are two brothers, we can live separately. But when the division takes place all over the world, among the two brothers, division is final. It is taken up to the root. You don't say, okay, this plot is mine, this house is mine, this is a big plot, we will think about it later. You don't do that. You just divide everything neat and clean. Today you see Pakistan, it's famous only for exporting terrorism. It does not have enough to eat, and all the time it is with begging bowl. And it is all the time on proxy war with India.
What happened to India after the British left? How did the empire lose its other colonies? What were the real reasons for its collapse? And is there a sense of nostalgia for imperial times in modern Britain? We will tell you all about this in the second part of our film about the rise and fall of one of the most powerful empires in the world.